Well, hi everybody. My name is Russ Lichterman. I'm an educational technology specialist here at Wilmington University. I work in the same department with Barb and Mary Beth, who you've been spending the day with. Of course, I'm here at the Wilson Graduate Center in Newcastle. I hope we're able to deliver an effective workshop for you today. This way, we're going to be talking about copyright and fair use in education, digital media, and beyond. So I have a PowerPoint presentation we're going to get into, and I'll be able to come back here and pop into the chat room and look at your questions. So I've built in a couple of breakpoints where we'll come out of the PowerPoint and come back here. I can answer some of your questions, and then we'll get back into it. And also, for everybody who's attending today, I'll get your emails from Barb and from Mary Beth, and I'll make sure and send you a PDF copy to your email of the agenda and of the PowerPoint. And the agenda and the PowerPoint slides, besides having all of the sources that I researched for this information, they also have some great resources when we get into talking about public domain and Creative Commons. So I'll make sure you get all of that information. So let's just jump into it because it's a lengthy presentation, and I want to make sure that you guys have time to ask whatever questions you want. All right, so here we are. We're here to talk about copyright and fair use when it comes to education, digital media, and beyond. We've been doing this presentation live in person here at the Grad Center for a few months, and we wanted to give an opportunity for some of the people located at other locations to take a look. So, of course, we're delivering this in a live streaming format that's sort of unusual, and this is our first time trying it out, so I hope it works out for everyone. So let me start out with this. I want to give you a brief disclaimer. I'm not a lawyer. I am not offering legal advice or representation. However, this is information that I've researched based on U.S. copyright law and based on the fair use doctrine. So I'm giving you information that I've researched to the best of my knowledge. But in no way, shape, or form does this represent legal advice or me representing you as a lawyer or an attorney in any way, because I'm not any of those things. But I am fairly well informed. So, to start with, let's talk about copyright. Copyright is a part of the U.S. law that protects original works in a fixed tangible medium. So even the internet can be considered a fixed tangible medium. You used to have to, in the old days, submit things to the U.S. Copyright Office and fill out forms. You don't have to do that anymore. Copyright law now, as soon as you commit a work to a tangible medium, it becomes automatically copyrighted. And that covers both published and unpublished works. And again, the internet even counts as a tangible medium. And of course, that's a change that has been added in fairly recent years. So using other people's work, though, is really important to grow culture. So although copyright law protects original content holders, it's also really important that people be able to reuse existing material, because under the right circumstances, using existing material is really important for generating new culture. Not everything can be created completely from scratch. We have to be able to draw on other influences. So the copyright law needed to have a way to be balanced out. And the way that that's balanced out is through fair use. Fair use is essentially a legal exemption of copyright law. Copyright law has several features that allow for people to use work. Fair use is the most common of those. Something to keep in mind is fair use isn't stealing. Fair use is a legal exemption of copyright doctrine. It balances the rights of users with the rights of copyright holders. Something we're going to revisit a number of times today is the idea that it's situational. Fair use is always situational. So understanding fair use is not even the hardest part of it. The most difficult part for us as educators can be applying fair use. And that's the thing. The fair use doctrine is really important to us as educators. It encourages quality education. It encourages us to have dynamic, interesting content that's engaging to our students. So we as educators really need to make use of the fair use doctrine. It allows us to be better teachers, but it's also very important for us to act ethically, because we ask our students to act ethically. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is how you figure out when to apply the fair use doctrine, because everything is situational, and we're going to keep revisiting that everything is situational when it comes to fair use. Materials that are used in education will very often fall under the fair use doctrine. That doesn't mean they'll always be fair use, but they'll often fall under the fair use doctrine. Even materials that are used online can be protected by fair use, especially if they're used on a restricted access network like Blackboard. And that's something that's really going to be key, and we'll talk about that later. Fair use is not the same as licensing. There are times when a licensing agreement precludes fair use. Now, that's not to say just because a copyright holder demands a licensing fee doesn't mean that they're always correct either. A copyright holders always want to get money from you if they can. You still may be legally entitled to use apply the fair use doctrine and use their work, but that's where it gets very tricky, and I'm going to help you understand how you can apply that. Fair use is always situational. Its interpretation changes depending on circumstances, and that's something that we're going to keep revisiting again and again. Fair use is always situational. So how do you determine fair use? And this is a big, big part of the problem, that a lot of times administrators or educators or school boards in the public sector especially will come up with sort of these checklists and rigid rules about, and I'm sure you've all heard of these kinds of things before, where, oh, you can use 30 seconds of a song, you can use 500 words of a journal article, you can use 2 pictures out of a book or 10% of a textbook. None of that is true. Everything with fair use is situational. So there's a few different characteristics that you can use to determine fair use. And this is how you can figure out if your own use falls under the fair use doctrine. What's the purpose and the character? Did you transform the original? The transformativeness standard is one of the most important standards when you come up with fair use. Did you change the original material? What about the nature of the material? Is it factual? Is it creative? Is it consumable? Factual material is very easy to put into fair use. Creative material can be a little trickier because you have to make sure you're using it for a different method than it was intended, and we'll talk about where the creative balance sort of falls with fair use. Consumable material, like workbooks, things that are meant to be used and discarded, never fall under fair use. What about the amount used? Now, again, let's talk about, oh, well, you've probably heard people say you can use 45 seconds of a song, you can use 500 words of a journal article, or 10% of this textbook. None of that is accurate. What's in the fair use doctrine, what's a part of copyright law is, did you use only the amount necessary? What if the amount necessary is the whole thing? Then that's okay. But if it's not, you better have a good reason to justify fair use. So there is no specific number. You have to use the amount that's necessary. Keeping in mind, the more you use, the more scrutiny your fair use argument might fall under. What about the effect on the market? Are you going to take away profits from the copyright holder? Now that's something that you need to consider too, and this is something that is used in judging fair use. Are you giving away something for free that someone usually charges for? That means you're impacting the same market of the original copyright holder. But let me give you a situation where we can apply some of these standards and they'll work for fair use. Suppose you're teaching English literature and you really want to show Romeo and Juliet, the one that came out in 1995 with Leonardo DiCaprio. Well, if you're going to use that as a teaching tool, now, even if it's just to illustrate a point or to help understand material, that's transformative, because the original purpose is entertainment, and instead you're using it for education. But you have to have a good justification for that, and if that's to help illustrate a complex piece of literature like Shakespeare, that's legitimate. Did you use the amount necessary? Well, to really understand it, you probably do need to show the whole movie. What about the effect on the market? Are you taking away profits? Well, if you're showing it in class for educational purposes, you're not showing it for entertainment, so you're not really impacting the same core market. So let me show you a poster, and this is something put together by the Adam 12 5-star schools, and it's also available from the Temple University Media Lab. And this is something that they make for people to sort of put in your copiers and libraries or distribute as handouts. And these give you the standards for fair use, and it kind of tells you what the words mean and sort of asks you the questions and say, you consider and decide. It's on you as the educator. You know the material better than anyone else. So you can ask yourself these questions, and this is how you can help determine fair use. If you ask yourself these questions, and keep in mind, it doesn't have to be 100% yes, it doesn't have to be 100% no. Fair use is always shades of gray. Interpreting copyright law, interpreting the fair use doctrine is always situational, and that means it's rarely going to be 100% one way or 100% the other way. But by asking yourself these questions, you can really get a feel for whether your situation is fair use. So let's talk some more about determining fair use, because that's really the bulk of what the question is here. How do I know if I'm breaking the law as an educator? A lot of times we err too much on the side of caution, and we give up rights that we do have under fair use. Of course, there are people who take it to the other extreme and say, I'm an educator, so anything goes. My use must always be fair use. So this is how we can further determine if our use as educators is fair use. Now, they revisit this idea here that there's no one checklist that fits every situation. In fact, checklists are actually a really bad idea because you have to judge every fair use case individually. It's all situational. So more about determining fair use. Factual works are almost always fair use. That's very easy. Charts and graphs, facts and figures, years, dates that certain things happened, history, math. Those things are almost always fair use to quote factual information. Creative works can be a little trickier, but creative works can fall under the fair use doctrine if the presentation is transformative, just like we talked about with Romeo and Juliet. The original purpose is entertainment. So if you're using it to illustrate a point and you're using it for educational purposes, that can be considered transformative, especially if you're using it for commentary and criticism. Commentary and criticism are probably the #1 area where the fair use doctrine gets applied when it comes to creative works. So again, that Romeo and Juliet film, it could fall under commentary and criticism, or maybe a more modern film would fall under commentary and criticism in the classroom. But even if you're just using it to illustrate a point, to say, Shakespeare's hard to understand, we're going to watch a movie to go along with reading the text, that's still okay. Even illustrating a point can be considered transformative. Consumable items like workbooks, intended to be used once and repurchased, are never ever fair use. Now, I know it's difficult. We're in higher education, books are expensive. Maybe we want to assign a particular workbook and it's a little pricey, so we think, well, if we just Xeroxed a few pages, what harm could it do? When an item is meant to be consumable, meaning it's meant to be filled out, used once, and then thrown away, unfortunately, that is never ever going to fall under fair use. Ultimately, when it comes to determining fair use, you want to think about those standards, and you want to use logic. You want to go with your gut feeling. If you feel like you're stealing, you probably are. If you feel in your gut like you're doing okay, then maybe it's okay under fair use. The standards are to help you guide your own ethical and moral judgment, and it's always important for us as educators to treat source material ethically. Fair use is very important because copyright owners are not entitled to an absolute monopoly over their work. But when a use supplants a copyright owner's core market, it's unlikely to be fair, meaning it's unlikely to be considered fair use. So when you think about that effect on the market, the way the court looks at that is, are you supplanting the core market? Meaning, are you taking away the core market who's intended to purchase this material? A lot of times when you're using it in the classroom, you're not supplanting the core market. Let me give you another example, and we'll kind of go back to the idea, and I think all of us have been in this situation. So we'll go back to this idea of an educator who's showing Romeo and Juliet in an English literature class for educational purposes to illustrate the points about Shakespeare. That's okay under fair use. But now think back to public school. Were you ever in a situation in public school where the teacher just wanted that period to grade some exams, so they put on a movie and said, here, watch the movie, and I'm going to sit in the back and I'm going to grade papers? If you're using it for entertainment purposes, you're not meeting the transformativeness standard because you're using it for the same intended purposes as the original, and you are supplanting the core market. If that movie is meant to be watched for entertainment and paid for by that market, and instead you're giving it away for free, then you are supplanting the core market, and you're not meeting the transformativeness standard as well. So just showing a movie for pure entertainment value, unfortunately, is not fair use. It has to be transformative, and it has to address a different core market. And again, it all comes back to how you feel. If it feels like it's educationally valuable, then it probably is. But if it feels like, you may be stealing, then you probably are. So let's talk about why correct interpretation is important. And now we're living in an era of SOPA, PIPA, internet pirates. The Pirate Bay founder goes to jail. The guy who founded Mega Upload gets fined hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he goes to jail. We see moms in middle America that downloaded 8 songs for their iPod getting hit with $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 in fines. these are the reasons why correct interpretation is important. We're in an era of internet piracy. We see that copyright holders are aggressively targeting people who are stealing their material. Of course, it doesn't happen to most people, but when it does happen to somebody, they like to make an example out of them. This is why correct interpretation is important, because we don't want to be held fiscally responsible. We certainly don't want to be held criminally responsible. The opposite side of that coin is a lot of times educators give up their right to fair use because of fear. We hear about thousands and thousands of dollars of fines for illegal downloading, so we get scared and we actually give up our right to fair use, a right that we are legally entitled to under copyright law. That's why it's important as educators that we act in good faith. It's important to treat source material ethically. Source material should always be properly cited, and this is something, of course, we preach to our own students. APA formatting, citing all your sources, not plagiarizing. Well, we need to set that example as well. We need to practice what we preach. Now, if you evaluate your material and your use does go beyond the scope of fair use, then you need to obtain permission from the copyright holder. The good news is the copyright holder might give you permission for free, because after all, we are educators in higher ed at a nonprofit university. You might get permission from the copyright holder, but they might ask for a licensing fee. And if they ask for a licensing fee, then you have to decide you either want to pay the licensing fee or you find different material to use. But make sure you have exhausted the idea of fair use first before you ask the copyright holder about licensing. Because believe me, if they can get money from you, they're probably going to want to. So make sure you have checked and figured out that your use is definitely not fair use before you go and offer to pay them for their material. Now, let's talk about educational use guidelines, and this is something that happens more so in public school, more so in secondary school or even elementary school, but it could happen in higher ed as well, where somebody says to you, oh, well, these are our rules for what's fair use and what's not. You're allowed to use 30 seconds of a song. You're allowed to use 500 words of an essay. You're allowed to use 10% of a journal article. None of those things are part of that law. Educational use guidelines are not part of the fair use doctrine, and they're not part of copyright law. You have to examine your own use and make a good faith judgment. Fair use is always situational. Every case is different. No checklist is ever going to be an accurate representation of whether something is always fair use or always not. In fact, fair use itself, it's never going to be 100%. It's always going to be shades of gray. That's why it's really important on us to learn how to evaluate our own material and be able to make a legitimate argument, being able to say, no, I understand fair use, I know what it is, and I think that I have an explanation for you as to why my material should be fair use. So this is something people always enjoy. Let's talk about common myths. Common myths about fair use, and these are things that people always sort of enjoy looking at. So let's talk about the first one. Fair use is too complicated for the instructor. It needs to be decided by lawyers and administrators. Of course, the truth is fair use is meant to be decided by the educator. You're the one who knows the needs in your classroom. You have the best understanding of what your material is and how it can be used in class and whether it falls under fair use. Don't wait for a lawyer or administrator to tell you if you are operating under the fair use doctrine or not. Because guess what? When it comes to lawyers and administrators, they're always going to err on the side of caution. It's not too complicated for you. All you have to do is think about the standards of fair use and apply them to your own work. And if you can make a good, legitimate argument, those lawyers and administrators are going to back down because chances are you're going to show a better understanding of how to judge fair use than they will. So here's another myth. There are specific rules about what's fair use and what isn't. 500 words of text, 10% of a video. Well, we just talked about that. There are no cut and dry rules for fair use. And that's a huge myth out there. Those numbers are completely arbitrary, and they are not part of the fair use doctrine or copyright law. It depends completely on the situation and the context. How about this myth? Fair use is only for critiques, comedies, or parodies. Nope. The truth is the transformativeness standard can be applied in a lot of ways, and of course it's an important factor in determining fair use, but it's not the only attribute. It's really important to think about all of the standards. Just because you don't meet the transformativeness standard, now of course that's going to be a big red flag, but using a copyrighted work to illustrate a key point can still be considered fair use so long as it adds important pedagogical value. The transformativeness standard is very flexible, and you can meet it in ways that you might not first realize. It doesn't have to be commentary and criticism. It can be used just to illustrate a point. And here's another myth. As long as it's not making money, it's fair use. And this is where we get into the danger zone. And this is also where good faith efforts and acting ethically in every situation are important. Just because you're not making money off of something doesn't make it fair use. And this is a trap that some educators fall into. Here's a little example. Sometimes public displays that are not transformative could be considered unfair and not fall under the fair use doctrine, even if they reach a wide audience and even if no money is involved. On the other hand, a work could have commercial intent and still qualify as fair use if the copyrighted work is deemed to be transformative. So just because you make money off of something doesn't necessarily mean it's automatically not fair use, and just because you don't make any money off something doesn't mean it's automatically fair use. And they've given you an example there that even if you're not making money, if it hits a wide audience and you're supplanting the core market, you're still taking money away from the copyright holder. And that may not fall under fair use. Just because you're not making money, you can't supplant the copyright holder's core market. And here's some dangerous myths that sometimes we hear as educators. Any copyrighted material is fair use as long as it's used in education. And this is a really dangerous one because it's something that we hear a lot. We do hear from other educators, and maybe some of us have even been guilty of thinking this ourselves. Well, as long as I'm an educator and I'm using it in class, it's fair game. And of course, as we've learned, that's not the case. Fair use is situational and it's contextual. It's always important to ask the key questions to see if fair use applies in your situation. And perhaps the worst possible myth of all, an educator can't get in trouble for violating copyright law. Guess what? We can get in trouble for violating copyright law. Being considered in violation of copyright can come with very stiff fines and penalties and even jail time. Anyone can be sued for copyright infringement. Is it likely? No. But if the fair use doctrine is applied incorrectly, even if it's a misunderstanding, an educator can still be held liable. Now, chances are first thing you would get would be a cease and desist letter before any legal action is taken. And even then, just because somebody sends you a letter doesn't mean they're automatically right. If you have a good, legitimate fair use claim, you can respond to that cease and desist letter with, no, this is why I feel this is fair use, and here's my reasons why. They might send you a letter just because they want you to stop and pay some licensing fee. Doesn't mean they're right. But believe me, educators can be found liable, and it has happened in the past. It's extremely unlikely, but it can happen. As always, intent and acting in good faith is key. Every situation is different. So let's talk about copyright and fair use as it pertains to distance learning. And of course, that's something that's of great interest to us here at Wilmington University, and us in particular in the Educational Technology and Online Learning Department. But I'm sure many of you may be, if not online instructors or hybrid instructors currently, perhaps exploring the idea of teaching online. And, you know, we're sort of a lot of times made to think that having material on the internet is very different. Well, let's talk about a few things. First, the TEACH Act. You may have heard of the TEACH Act in 2002 that made some specific stipulations and allowances in the copyright law to provide exemptions for distance learning. What it was is they needed to modify copyright law in 2002 because the internet had gotten so huge and the internet was such a major factor. So the TEACH Act addresses technology in teaching and education and helps make some allowances for material stored online. But guess what? The TEACH Act does not have anything to do with fair use. You can still claim fair use even if the terms of the TEACH Act are not met. The TEACH Act makes exemptions to the copyright law. It doesn't change the fair use doctrine. If something is fair use in a brick-and-mortar face-to-face classroom, it's still fair use even on the internet. The TEACH Act has nothing to do with whether something is fair use or not. If you can claim fair use in your in-person class, you can also claim fair use online, on the internet, in a blog, in a discussion forum, or even in Blackboard. And we'll talk about Blackboard too. The same fair use analysis applies to all formats and mediums, including the digital environment. So you do not have to make any special allowances if you're storing material online. If it's fair use in class, it's fair use on the internet. And in fact, the digital environment from an educational standpoint is not only the same, but even a little bit better if you're using a restricted access network like Blackboard. Blackboard actually gives us even more protections because not everyone in the whole world can get into it. So if you're keeping your materials in Blackboard, and again, Blackboard falls under what they call a restricted access network, then you're going to even have a better fair use argument because it's not out there for everyone to see. It's only going to be accessible by students at Wilmington University in that particular class, and only for a limited amount of time. They're only able to get into course material for a couple of semesters while they're in school in that class, and then the following semester or two. So things that are stored on Blackboard in a restricted use environment are actually can make a much better fair use argument than things that are just out on a blog or on a web page or on the standard open access internet. However, the open access internet can still be considered to fall under the same fair use standards. So this is the 5 principles, the code of best practices in fair use. And I got this from the Temple University Media Education Lab. And the Temple Media Lab is a great sort of resource for understanding how any number of things out in the world interact with education. And they have a great site set up for how to interact with fair use and how to apply fair use in the educational environment. So this gives you some best practices. It tells you some things that educators can do and even some things that students can do. And these are things, and again, in general, that will usually fall under fair use. You still have to apply the standards individually to your own case. But in general, these best practices are usually going to be okay for you as an educator. So if you do something like this already as a starting point, and then think about some of those standards of the fair use doctrine, you'll be able to go back and really figure out your own fair use case. But if you're starting from something that falls under one of these codes of principles of best practice, then you're starting from a very, very good point to try to determine fair use. So making copies of media, newspaper articles, TV shows, usually falls under fair use if they're used for educational purposes. Creating curriculum materials and scholarship with copyrighted materials that are embedded, and even sharing, selling, and distributing curriculum materials with copyrighted material embedded. Believe me, when somebody publishes a textbook, and it uses charts, graphs, quotes from someone else, even if that is copyrighted material, they've come up with some fair use claim. They're not paying a licensing fee or obtaining permission every time. They may be selling that material even though they're making a profit off it, and they may be falling under the fair use doctrine. It even tells you a little bit here about what learners can do. And again, I'll make sure that everybody gets access to this material. So, thinking more about the best practices of determining what is copyrighted material that can be licensed, what is copyrighted material that should fall under fair use, what falls under public domain, and what falls under Creative Commons, and how to interpret those Creative Commons licenses. Those are all the different choices that you have, and you have to decide what's best in your situation. Knowing the difference between all of these things is sort of the first step. Knowing what fair use is, what things fall under fair use and what things don't, can help you decide if then you need to approach licensing, or if instead you need to look at public domain materials or things that fall under Creative Commons and interpreting those Creative Commons licenses. Another responsibility, of course, we have as educators is to act in good faith. And that's one of the most important things of all. We ask our students to be bound by a code of conduct here at Wilmington University, to be bound by certain academic standards, and we need to follow those things as well. We need to approach our material morally and ethically in the same way that we ask students to do. It's very, very important, and it's going to give you the best chance at determining fair use correctly. Because if something feels wrong and it feels immoral, then chances are pretty good it's not fair use. Lastly, if your use doesn't fall under the fair use doctrine and the material isn't public domain, you would need to contact the copyright holder for permission or to make licensing arrangements. But again, make sure you exhaust all of your fair use options before you go and ask the copyright holder for licensing. Because believe me, most copyright holders will be more than happy to offer you a licensing arrangement and take your money, even if you would have had a legitimate fair use claim. So always think about fair use first, and then if you determine that your use can't possibly be fair use, then talk to the copyright holder, find out about permission or licensing, and if you can't get it, or maybe look for alternative sources like public domain. So what is public domain? And a lot of us know the answer to that already, but public domain means works that are either ineligible for copyright protection or have expired copyrights. No permission whatsoever is needed for public domain works. None at all. Public domain is completely 100% free, and you don't need anyone's permission. But guess what? It's not as easy as it sounds to determine public domain. Parts of works that should be public domain might still be copyrighted. For example, a film might be in the public domain but not the soundtrack. And here is a great example, and this actually comes right from the Copyright and Fair Use Overview at Stanford University. Suppose you've got a musical, and it's a movie musical. It's got songs in it by Cole Porter. The movie itself is in the public domain because of a failure to renew copyright, meaning it's a number of years old, and the film itself is in the public domain. But music renews on a different copyright cycle than movies do, and so do books, and so do paintings, and so does everything else. Everything has a different copyright cycle. Well, suppose Warner Brothers owns the rights to the movie and the music, and although they've let the copyright expire on the movie, they did renew the copyright on the Cole Porter songs because those are also on an album. Well, that means that although the film is in the public domain, the songs aren't. So in order to use that film, you would either have to get permission from the copyright holder to play the songs, or you would have to remove the audio. And in fact, I'll bet you've been in situations where you've been on YouTube and you go to, say, look up an old movie like The Jazz Singer. Now, that's from 1927. The copyright is long since expired on The Jazz Singer. But all of the songs performed by Al Jolson in The Jazz Singer, those are still under copyright. So if you go to look for The Jazz Singer on YouTube, chances are very good you're not going to be able to find the musical portions. You'll only be able to find the silent film portions. So public domain can be very, very tricky because music can have a separate copyright even in a film that has fallen into the public domain. So don't assume that just because something crosses a certain year mark or shows up on a list of public domain that carte blanche everything in it is public domain, because movies have a lot of components. They've got audio, they've got dialogue, they've got music, so it can be very, very tricky to determine public domain 100%. Now, beyond public domain, we get into the idea of Creative Commons. Creative Commons is, if you've never heard of it before, a nonprofit organization that enables the sharing and use of creativity and knowledge through free legal tools. Basically, Creative Commons licenses are a simple, standardized way to give the public permission to share and use your creative work on the conditions that you choose. Creative Commons is an easy way for a copyright holder to tell you right up front how you can use their work. Creative Commons licenses are not an alternative to copyright. They work alongside copyright and enable you to modify your copyright terms to best suit your needs. So remember, as soon as you commit a work to a tangible medium, that work is automatically copyrighted. So if you want to say prima facie, I'm going to allow use of this work under certain circumstances, that's when you can apply a Creative Commons license. So although your work is automatically copyrighted, you're telling the user, the person who might want to use your copyrighted work, I'm going to allow this under these circumstances. And a Creative Commons license tells you right on the front exactly how you can use a work. So this is a Creative Commons license chart. And hopefully you've seen some of these Creative Commons licenses around. And of course, if you go to creativecommons.org, they have a huge library of resources where people will say, we've agreed to sort of apply the Creative Commons licenses, and here's our link to our set of resources, our database of stuff. So when you look around at these different Creative Commons licenses, the different symbols on the license will tell you exactly how you can use it. The most common one is usually attribution. And if you look at these checklists, it'll kind of show you that if they use certain symbols, it'll tell you how you can use it and what you can use it for. So if it only has the attribution license and nothing else, that means as long as you give the original creator attribution, meaning you cite them as the original creator, attribute them to their own work, you can even use it for commercial purposes and modify the work. And you see they've got a number of different symbols, like there's a non-commercial symbol, there's a no derivative symbol, and it gets sort of more and more specific as it goes down, and it shows you how you can and can't use it. So Creative Commons is a great way to find material that you can use in class and will tell you right on the front how you can use it. Great thing about Creative Commons is you don't have to figure out fair use. If someone puts that Creative Commons license there, they're telling you right up front how you can use the work. that means you don't have to go and try to figure out your fair use standards. Is it transformative? Is it creative? Is it consumable? If they've given you right on the front the Creative Commons license, then you know how you can use it. And the great news is CreativeCommons.org has a huge database of Creative Commons licensed resources. So that's a really, really great tool to have. So speaking of some of those resources, here is a number of those links. And before we jump back into the questions, I'm going to point out here there's a whole list of links of public domain resources. That's music, movies, photos, and literature that are all in the public domain. And these are guaranteed to be safely in the public domain. So there's some music links, some movies, some photos, and some literature, and those are really great databases. And again, I'm going to send everybody this PowerPoint. Don't feel like you have to scribble these all down now. I'm going to email this to you as soon as I get everybody's info, and I'll make sure you have this. And you can also go through and see where I gathered all this material from, and you can check out these original sources and see even more in depth if you're interested. And of course, there right at the top is CreativeCommons.org, and Creative Commons is another great, great place to find resources that aren't going to be public domain, but they'll at least tell you exactly how you can legally use that material without trying to figure out copyright and fair use.